I started my career as a programmer. Did you know that about me? If I told you what my favorite language is, you'd know when I started my career as a programmer. Any guesses? No. No. Assembler. It's like doing puzzles and you have a lot of control. But I haven't, I've done other things. I've done testing, I was a dev manager, I was an internal consultant. And most of the work I do, actually for the last 20 years, has to do with creating work environments where people can be more successful and where people can hopefully find some joy in their work. I find that our organizational dynamics have a huge impact on our ability to be successful, so that's where I work. And that usually means that some change is involved. So that's the topic of this talk. But before I get there, maybe I should tell you where I'm from. If you're not familiar with U.S. geography, I live in a town called Duluth, Minnesota. It's 1,200 miles from the coast. How many kilometers is that? Anyone know? Lots. And we're a seaport, which I think is kind of amazing. I moved there because my husband, it's right near the Canadian border. I moved there because my husband thought that the biggest town in our state, Minneapolis, was too hot, which is sort of an astonishing thing, but that's why we moved there, because Minneapolis, which you see where it is on the map, was too hot. Anyway, that's where I live. And I work with lots of companies about their change. I made a change moving to Duluth. You learn all sorts of things about that. It's a topic that I care a lot about. How many of you are currently involved in some sort of change at work? Yeah. How many of you heard something during this conference that you want to go back to work and make some sort of change? Okay, so we've got pretty much everybody covered here. I want to talk first about our legacy of thinking about change. Because I think, like I said, we have a hangover about mechanistic thinking. I think we have some change hangovers too. So one of the ways that change happens in organizations is someone in a corporate Elysium, an executive Elysium, comes up with a wonderful idea and drops it through a hole in the ceiling on top of the unsuspecting people below. Has anyone ever experienced that sort of change? Yes. How was it? It's puzzling, it's confusing, you feel like you're being jerked around, it's not much fun. Right, so this is the very top-down model of change that we've all been familiar with. How many of you have ever heard people talk about driving change? Yeah. Well, there was a brief method mention in our panel about metaphor. And these words actually kick off a certain series of thoughts in our brains that generally go one or two directions. Either you're driving a herd of cattle. How many of you like to be driven like a herd of cattle? Yeah, I didn't think so. Or you're driving a car down a smooth path, right? These are not helpful ways to think about change, but I hear people talk about driving change a lot. Like, we're going to drive these people to do something different. I hear people talk about installing change, like it's turning a light bulb. Just changing the light bulb. We'll just put in this new widget and everything will be great. And I hear people talk about implementing change, like just enacting a law. We're just going to declare it so, and it will work. Anybody ever talk about implementing change in that way? See, these things belie the complexity of what we're dealing with change. And I think we really need to move beyond some of these metaphors that we've been using for years and think about it differently. There's one more, though, that we should talk about. How many of you have in your title or have in some part of your job description the word evangel or evangelize? A couple hands go up. It's really common. It's really common in the U.S. that we have our evangelists. Where do you think that word comes from? Religious conversion. And it is always the sainted person coming to save the people from the darkness that they have been living in. How do you think people enjoy that? I think most people don't. Plus, this is what sometimes happens. So when you go in to tell people they've been wrong for a long time, you often don't have a pleasant outcome. So all of these metaphors are really common. All of these words we use are really common, and they really, really get in our way. They make change sound like it can be pushed. Can push it onto people. We're going to drive them. It makes it sound like it's simple. Just screw in a new light bulb here, a new fixture. What we really need to think about, rather than driving change or installing change, is how can we nurture change in complex environments? Nurturing complex change in complex environments, where we pay attention to the humans and we pay attention to the systems that we're living in. So based on my research and my work helping many organizations to change, I have derived 6 rules. Or maybe they're heuristics. Dave will tell me. These are not stepwise. You don't necessarily do them in a particular order, but these are 3 or 6 things that are really helpful to pay attention to when you're looking at any kind of change in an organization, whether it's large or whether it's small. So the first one is to start from a stance of congruence. The way I use the word congruence comes from the work of Virginia Satir, and she talks about that as a matter of balancing your own needs, the needs of the other people you're working with, and the context. Keeping those things in balance. Congruence is dynamic. It's a process. It's not static. You don't get there and just stay there forever. So you have to constantly be monitoring, checking your internal state, being aware of the needs of the people around you. Do they want this change? Are they ready for it? Does it make sense to them? Is it their priority? What does the context require? Are we in a business failure that we really need to take quick action? Or is this change something that was dreamed up by an executive on the golf course? Right? Keep these things in mind. How do you feel about the change? How do you feel about the people you're working with? And it's always a balance. It's always, you're making micro adjustments to this as you work with people, as you learn more about what's going on. It's important because this is the position from which you can access your best thinking. When you're off balance, you're working on getting rebalanced, not necessarily on connecting with people and doing your best thinking, doing your best problem solving. When you are centered, you can think clearly, and you can also access your empathy. We've had a couple of talks this week about the importance of empathy. Most people think about it in terms of emotional empathy, whereas you can at least imagine and validate another person's emotional state. Doesn't mean you have to fix it. Doesn't mean you have to feel the same way they do, but you have to acknowledge it as valid. Give them some space. There are other kinds of empathy, though, that are very useful in change. Cognitive empathy, which is a matter of understanding how other people think. So if you can understand how someone thinks about the dynamics of software development, and they think it can all be planned up front, that gives you some insights to work with when you talk to them about the changes you're thinking about. If you can understand the way they think and imagine it, even if you don't agree with it, you're much more likely to have a useful conversation. Point of view empathy is another kind of empathy, which says, I can see how it looks to you from where you stand. And how things look depends a lot on where you sit in the organization. Right? So having cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, point of view empathy. And sometimes empathy is an action. Sometimes it's an action. I experienced this at the speaker's dinner, actually. I don't know if you can see it. I have a little bit of a hand tremor. And it's worse when I'm tired. It's worse when I'm jet-lagged. And they served me soup. And it was quite clear after my first attempt that the soup was not going to make it from the bowl with the spoon to my mouth. One of the other people at the table noticed this. She picked up her soup and she drank it from the bowl. And then another person at the table picked up her soup and drank it from the bowl. And then I did it. That was a profound act of empathy. So it doesn't have to just be hearing what people are feeling. You can make an act of empathy that enables someone else to do something to be more effective, to improve the way their work life is working. But you can only do it from congruence. So that's the first rule, and that's the one you will come back to over and over and over again. Second rule is to honor the past. Honor what is valuable about what has been and what's working now. Don't make people wrong. Making people wrong is a sure way to get people to hold on harder. So part of that means you have to shift your language and talk about, this served us well up until now. You know, this was the best thing we could come up with at the time. So you're not criticizing or implying that people are stupid, bad, or wrong for doing things the way they're doing them. Most likely, people are doing them that way because of the last round of change, or because things got to be the way they are over time. So it's really important not to make people wrong, to acknowledge what's working, and build on it. Build on it wherever you can. I have seen organizations where they come in with a new method and it's like they take the fruit basket and throw everything up in the air, and suddenly nothing works, right? They may have had some things working and need some tweaking, but now nothing works. So build on what's there. Build on what's there, and know what you want to keep. Knowing what you want to keep is just as important as knowing what you want to change. You can't always accomplish that, but it's a very useful thing to think about. Assume that the people you're working with are not empty vessels. You are not just coming in and pouring new knowledge into their heads. They have valuable information that will help you as you try to make any sort of change. One of the reasons this is so important is that people often attach meaning, personal meaning, to their jobs. So have any of you seen Hidden Figures? Have any of you seen that movie? Some of you have. It's a very interesting movie about a group of African American mathematicians who worked for NASA doing trajectory calculations. All of that stuff used to be done by hand. And those women, among many other women, there were often women who did it, had a really important job. And they were replaced by computers, right? Who could do the math much faster. In many cases, they were replaced. Not all of them were. And some of them committed suicide. Not from that movie, not the women in that movie, but in other situations, because their meaning was gone. They'd been replaced. They were no longer meaningful. People will hold on to what they value, and if you take their meaning away, it can be devastating to them. So it's important that we honor them, and if possible, find a way for them to have meaning in the new situation. I know at the beginning of the dawn of Agile, people used to talk about not needing managers, and there were a couple talks about that this week too. And I certainly think it is valid to re-examine the role of managers, and I know companies where they are getting along without anyone in management, a hierarchical management role. They're still doing management stuff, but they don't have anyone in that hierarchical role. I don't think that the rhetoric about not needing managers anymore did us any favors when we were first talking about Agile, because it made a whole bunch of people scared. It made a whole bunch of people say, I'm not valued anymore, I'm not valuable anymore, there's no place for me, which makes them hold on harder. So pay attention to this. People were doing the best they could given what they knew at the time. And when you listen to them and take that into account, recognize their journey, they are much more likely to listen to what you have to say. Third rule has to do with observation. I think this is a vastly underrated skill. When I was a kid, there was a children's party game called Pin the Tail on the Donkey. Do you have that game here? Something like it, where they have a poster of a very sad-looking donkey whose tail is missing. And every child at the party, or usually small children, is given a tail with a pin on it. And the object is for them to pin that tail in the correct place on this poor, sad-looking donkey. The complication is that the child who is taking his turn at this wonderful game is blindfolded and spun around rapidly by the party mother. So he's all dizzy and blindfolded and trying to stick the pin on the right donkey, right on the right place on the donkey. It was a horrifying game. But we don't want to be that dizzy kid. Right? We don't want to be blindfolded when we're trying to make a change. We don't want to be dizzy and blindfolded and just randomly trying stuff. We need to observe our current system. We need to look for what we can discern about what is holding the current situation in place. I think one of the biggest problems I see with changes is that people come up with this bright idea that they're going to add something, and they don't consider what they might need to take away in order to allow that new thing to come into being. A really common example is people say, well, we want collaboration, but they keep the individual performance reviews and stack ranking. So you have to observe what is holding the current pattern in place. Sometimes it's not that obvious, sometimes it's much more subtle. But that may tell you the first place you need to make some sort of change. It helps to observe what people understand, because that tells you what next step they are capable of. It tells you what people might need to learn or unlearn. It's really helpful to look at who benefits from the way things are now, because those people are going to want things to stay the same. That's natural, that's normal. You know, if they're benefiting from it, why wouldn't they want it to change? Who will benefit from the change? So observing all these things, who will work with you and what's possible from where you stand now, will help you in making any sort of change. Being aware of what is the next reasonable step, who's willing to work with me, what might I need to change, How can I move this situation forward? So I worked with one company that was, they actually used the word going agile. We're going agile. And the directors there were quite willing to try it, but they were also quite open about saying, you know, when it gets to bonus time, I may just throw this out because I want to make my bonus. You know, I might be telling people to pull all-nighters because I want to make my bonus. Until we changed that, that was going to be a really hard thing to do, right? I had a conversation with a test manager who was concerned that the people weren't interested in improving themselves and taking training. I asked a few questions, and it turned out that they were expected to have 100% utilization. So they had no time to take any training. You know, if they took any training, that was another 40 hours in the week. So until that changed, they weren't going to see much of a change of behavior. Sometimes you need to loosen those things up in order to make room for any kind of change to happen. And you won't find it unless you're observing. We'll come back to observation in just a minute, because it also is important to understand if your proposed change is having any sort of effect at all. And we talked a little bit about that at the panel, about how can you measure what's going on. Observation is a big part of that. Pay attention to networks. Do all of you have some kind of org chart for your company with nice little boxes, and it's nice and neat, and everybody fits in their little box, and there's arrows that usually go in a very linear way? Yeah. That's not actually how work gets done. Work gets done through relationships. But of course, you guys knew that, right? Relying on the formal hierarchy is dangerous in a number of ways. One, it tends to be top-down, so people feel like they are being ordered to change. How many of you like to be ordered to change? Nobody has raised their hand. So how many of you have heard people talk about resistors? Yeah. Has anybody in this room ever been labeled a resistor? Yeah. Well, in my experience, people don't resist change. They resist coercion. They resist being pushed or ordered or threatened. Right? So when you only rely on the hierarchy for change, you're going to get that sort of pushback effect. Not because people are bad or stupid or wrong, or even because the change is a bad idea. People resist coercion. The second danger of the hierarchy is that people's behavior looks different whether you're looking down or whether you're looking up. We have a phrase in the US called kiss up and kick down, which is a description of managers who make themselves look very good to the people above them, and they treat the people below them very badly. There's a lot of research that says that the characteristics that get you promoted and noticed are not necessarily characteristics that make you an effective manager. So I have often seen in companies the managers who appear to be influential because they have a broad reporting area, a broad number of reports, or because they control, budget or something, are not actually particularly. Did my mic just go? It just came back. Because they're not actually particularly well respected, right? They may have a lot of people reporting to them, but they're not particularly influential with the people who actually need to change. So relying on the formal network is a trap. And it's important to look at the informal networks that exist and figure out how you can make use of them. and to make sure that you don't inadvertently destroy an important network. My husband works for an engineering company. They have a whole bunch of different disciplines within their company. And they did a lot of cross-selling in their organization. Like, they'd run into someone and they'd say, well, I'm working on this project that, actually we could use some of your skills. We could actually use some environmental work on this. And they were very collegial, and they did a lot of work together across these disciplines. They were so successful that they were growing, and they needed more office space. So someone decided to turn their cafeteria, their lunchroom, into offices. And what do you think happened? Yeah. They didn't notice it immediately, but several months down the line, someone said, our sales funnel is still going pretty well, but we're not seeing as much of this work coming in from existing clients with existing projects. Wonder what that's about. And then my husband said, I don't feel very connected with this company anymore. I don't know what's going on in other parts of it. And then they put it together that, we had a very important network here where people were informally chatting about the projects they were working on, talking about, well, now that you mention it, this project could also use some of this. Let's get in front of the client. Let's put this in front of the client. So they inadvertently destroyed or dampened that network. It wasn't, it's still, the relationships were still there, although they eroded over time as people saw less of each other. And so they had to take some measures to create a way for people to mingle again, right? Because they had inactivated that network. So pay attention to those networks. Look particularly at who is trusted and who people go to for advice. And if you have the possibility of doing it, you can actually map this stuff, and it's really, really revealing, because those people who are trusted and who people approach for advice are a huge asset in making any sort of change. Because if you can get them on board, it's going to diffuse, right? It's going to diffuse naturally through the organization. The other advantage of using networks and change is that then you get a more holistic picture generally, right? If you're just going down the hierarchy, you just get this one narrow view. If you're using a network, you get a much broader view of how something is playing out in different parts of the organization. People can learn from each other about local adaptations. They can make adjustments. They can share successes. They can share their failures. I worked with a client that had, I don't know if I can actually count as high as the number of sites they had, but they had coaches in Europe, coaches in the Middle East, coaches in the East Coast of the US, and coaches in the West Coast of the US, none of whom knew each other. They were all supposed to be helping one program move forward. And one of the things I did was connect those people and get them to know each other and set up a little virtual place where they could have conversations. And they began sharing exactly those things. What has worked? What have we tried? What did you try? How can I adapt that? Getting a bigger picture of, well, we're seeing this on site A, but we're seeing something different in site B. What does that mean? Bringing in their observation skills. And it had a significant effect on the way that organization was able to move because they were using that network of coaches. So pay attention to those. One of the very powerful networks in many organizations is the network of smokers. Anybody in here smoke? A few people. So in the US, you can't smoke inside buildings, most office buildings. So the smokers all go outside and huddle around the door, which they have to be very hardy where I live because it's quite cold in the winter. And they're talking to people across the organization, right? Whoever happens to be out smoking, whether it's the VP or the mailroom guy, they're all out there talking. So that, I'm not advising you to take up smoking. That would be not a helpful idea. But that is a very interesting network in a lot of organizations, right? The smoker. So, get to know a smoker. You don't have to smoke with them. Get to know them. And insert some ideas that way. Okay. Guide the change. Consider where global principles apply and what can evolve locally, and work by a successive approximation. We talked about this on the panel. I mean, the idea is not to have something standard. The idea is to have coherence, right? You have a set of principles that may apply to everybody, but they can be implemented in slightly different ways or evolved in slightly different ways. So this is the analogy I like. Can anyone tell me what those leaves are? They're all actually different kinds of oak, right? And some of these oaks grow well in dry conditions. Some of them grow well in wet conditions. Some of them grow well in savannas. But they're all oaks, right? So you may need an oak, but the way that oak evolves depends on its environment. So you may say, we want to make work visible. How does that play out, right? Doesn't have to be the same way in each and every situation. It needs to be coherent, but not standardized unless it's crossing a boundary. In that case, you might think about standardizing. So if you think about light plugs, they're standard. They haven't always been, but they're standard now, right? So it's like, that's where you need something to be standardized. So, every lamp manufacturer in Poland, you can plug into the same sort of wall socket, it will work. Those are the areas where you need to think about standardization when you're crossing boundaries, when there's a handoff or an interface. But as a goal, standardization is generally quite wasteful and can make work much harder for some people. I worked on a project where we were given and this is just a crime against nature, we were given a standardized time reporting scheme that bore absolutely no relationship to the work that we did, right? But everybody in the whole company, this was a division of about 1,000 people. Everybody in this division was supposed to report time on these same sets of activities so that they could control us more appropriately, probably. That was probably we want to control these people and estimate more accurately. And what they ended up with was a mountain of false data, a mountain of absolutely useful data, because people just made stuff up to fit into this standard task, that bore no relationship. But probably bore relationship to some people's work, but not to the vast majority. So that sort of standardization made no sense. It was wasteful. It was inducive of cynicism, and basically just got in our way, right? So you might have some heuristics to help people think about, how do we play this out here? You might have some guidelines that say, when you're considering this, consider the needs of the organization, and this is our goal for the organization, consider the function of your department, and consider how what you're doing might affect the people that you work with. You might give some guidelines, but it's really essential to allow local evolution in these things, right? And pay attention, as Dave Snowden used the word coherence, and I like that word. You want something to make sense and hang together, but you don't necessarily want it to be standard. And work by successive approximation. You will not get it right the first time in most cases because you don't know what the organization is capable of. You don't know what they'll learn. In some ways, you can't imagine where you will end up from where you start now. So start with something. Look at how it's working out. Make some adjustments. Try again. Learn from what you're doing. Learn from what other parts of the organization are doing. And eventually you get to something that will work well enough for now until the next shift comes and you have to make another change. This is a very uncomfortable idea given our legacy of thinking we must figure out the right answer and plan it and roll it out. Right? We must have the one right way. We must have the one right answer. This is really tough given this hangover of mechanistic thinking and standardization that we're coming from, this efficiency thinking. But it's really essential. And I find this metaphor of oak leaves quite helpful. Design experiments that will facilitate learning and limit gratuitous disruption. Right? Big change feels like an existential threat. Small change allows for learning, and experiments are a great way to do that. I like to make experiments FINE, which stands for fast feedback, inexpensive, no permission needed, and easy. Make them fine, make them little, so you don't have to get a lot of permission. Just do the smallest thing you can and see how the system reacts. See how people react. See what they need to learn. See what the next step might be. This lets people get their fingerprints on the change, which means it's no longer being pushed on them. It means they are helping to design it. They're involved in it. They own it. It means they're learning. I like to, when I'm making changes in an organization, insert at least 3 ideas. Not too many. We have a tendency to glom onto the first remotely plausible idea that comes up. But if you insert 3, people have to think about which one makes sense. They get to make a choice. Right? Do it small, and then observe, detect, maybe measure, and evaluate. I think this is another area where we get caught up in our history, and we want to have a big outcome measurement, which is not so helpful if you're looking at small changes and you want to know if you're headed in the right direction. You need to be able to detect subtle changes that indicate, yeah, we're moving the way we wanted to go, or we're almost off a cliff, right? And that often doesn't come from big measurement. It comes from observing, right? Looking for these subtle signs. So one of the things I often do in organizations when I'm working with them to change things is I insert a different set of questions. One group I worked with, the dominant question among the managers when I arrived there, and it was almost always like this: how can we hold these people accountable? That was the level of their thinking about their issues around getting software to their customers. How can we hold these people accountable? So I started asking different questions when I was in meetings with people. I said, well, who's the they we're talking about? Who actually made that commitment? And they'd say, well, the team did. And say, well, it turned out it wasn't the team. It was someone in the project management or the product management organization who reported up to a different executive and had a completely different set of goals. So this, asking a different question led to a different type of problem solving. Right? Can you measure? Can you measure the sorts of questions people ask? Tom would say yes. And I suppose you can, but it might not be worth the money. So I listened, and I was able to detect when questions were being asked in a different way, when managers were asking different questions. So instead of assuming a stance of blame, they were trying to find out what was going on. They were trying to get more information. They were trying to understand the dynamics of how things worked. It was a subtle change. And the outcome measure would have been really long, but by observing and trying to detect this subtle difference, I could tell that things were moving in the right direction. And that's a really key thing. And then you can evaluate and you can adjust things. I mean, I've tried a lot of little experiments in organizations. One was the same organization where the people weren't being accountable. The teams were consistently having far more work pushed into their time boxes than historically they had been able to complete. So the first experiment I did with that was I put up I think it was the 6-month rolling average of how many they were using points, how many points they had delivered, to see if having that information in front of people would change their behavior about pushing work in. And I noticed that people looked at it with some curiosity and then continued their existing behavior. So my next experiment was to give them physical tokens. So if a team had completed 16 points, they got 16 poker chips that they could spend however they wanted. And they still kept begging for more. Can't I have more chips? I have more work to be done. I want more chips. But then it was easy to say, no more chips. You get 16. And that changed the behavior, right? I don't know how you would measure that. You could look at the fact that there were still lots of, there was a lot of overstuffing of these sprints. But I was observing behavior, right? Observing people looking at it, taking it in on some level, and then not acting on it. And making it physical changed that behavior. So, try your experiment, observe, detect, whether it's moving in the right direction or the wrong direction, and make some adjustments. These little tiny changes are far, far less disruptive to organizations, and yet over time can have a big impact. I mean, sometimes I talk to people who say, oh my God, it'll take forever if we just keep doing these tiny, tiny little changes. The reality is that the disruption and dealing with the disruption from a large change, a large-scale change, takes a huge amount of time and effort in and of itself. So these tiny changes don't freak people out. They let them learn. And as they learn, they can do the next thing. You know, a system is only capable of doing what the system can do and maybe one step further. It's not likely for systems to take a giant leap to the other end of the stage, which is what a lot of changes ask people to do. You know, if you go agile, you're asking people to go from a waterfall process or some sort of linear process all the way over there to iterative incremental, without having clear requirements all set up front. And that's really hard. So these little experiments, start here, you take this next step that they're capable of. And then you can take the next step that they're capable of. And you learn more about what the system will do and how it will respond, and you can adjust what you're doing. So these are my 6 rules. Always come back to congruence. If you are working with other humans, if you are working with change, you will find yourself off balance. And then you need to get back on balance and consider your own needs, the needs of the people you're working with, and the context that you're working in. Honor what's valuable about the past and what's working now. Don't make people wrong. Don't be that person who comes in and brings the light to those who have been living in darkness and sin. Respect what they've been doing before. They have valuable knowledge. They know stuff that you don't know that will help move things forward. Be observant. Don't be that kid. Don't be that dizzy kid with the blindfold and the tail, trying to get it on the donkey. Work on your abilities to observe, practice observation. Look at the current situation in the system. Look at what might be holding place. And then look at the effects of your experiments. Observe those. Figure out how to detect the subtle signs of those. Pay attention to the human networks in your organization. That's where work really gets done. And they are very powerful for diffusing ideas. Guide the change. Figure out what needs to be the same and where you can have variation based on local conditions. Use experiments in collaboration with the people that you're working with so that they're learning, they're getting their fingerprints on the change. You as a collaboration are figuring out how to move forward together. And you'll find that you can achieve really quite wonderful things by paying attention to people, respecting people, paying attention to the system, and the ability to change the structures and the system. And these are the heart of nurturing change in a complex environment. You will do great things. And now, in one of my personal change projects, I am trying to change the ratio of cute cats and cute dogs that are displayed in PowerPoint. So I have changed the ratio, but not by much, probably. This is my dog. So, thank you. I think we have a little time for questions.
I've got two questions. The first one is, have you ever taken part in the change that had victims? I mean, people who got fired after the change happened. And the second question is, what is your impression on so-called digital transformation and everything that is happening right now, also driven by the guys sitting here. So there is a lot of change and a lot of things that are taking victims.
Well, actually, one of the projects I worked on last year, and we had made some discernible progress. The product, they didn't get their product to market fast enough, and they lost their market, and that whole project was laid off. So they weren't fired because they were bad people or because the change effort wasn't successful. It was a market issue, which was really disappointing because they'd learned a lot. I have been in a situation where people have been threatened with being fired because they didn't get on the bus, they didn't get with the program, that kind of thing. I think that is a last resort. I mean, I think sometimes you do have to have a conversation with people about, this is the kind of work we have, this is the kind of work you want to do, and there's not, how these things they don't match. Sometimes there are other places in an organization where someone can be of value. But I personally think that threatening people with firing because they're not getting with the program is coercion. And that's within my moral frame, there are very few circumstances where I think coercion is a wonderful way to go, or a morally acceptable way to go. As for the digital transformation, I mean, we are so bombarded by change all the time that we don't always have a choice. And I think these rules still are helpful, right? We still can respect where people are coming from. We can still look at how can we avoid an artificial need for standardization, so we have a better ability to respond quickly. If we get used to the idea that we can adapt things, that often translates into the organization being more adaptable, which helps when the technology is moving very quickly.
Let's imagine that there is an umbrella under the part of the organization, because
There's a
an
what?
umbrella.
An umbrella.
Because if there is no one umbrella, the change in a culture, it's not possible. And then an umbrella is closed. So how to withdraw from comparing? Maybe the change is good, maybe not, I don't know. But how to behave in such a situation?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Can you try saying it in a little different words?
Okay, if you have this manager kicking down the people
Oh, yeah, that kind of manager.
and being nice up,
Okay.
and you can rise higher and rise the new group of manager for the part of an organization, and you decide to do it in this part, just an experiment, and it works. And then you want to spread this behavior in the whole organization. What do you recommend? How to do it?
So, if I'm understanding, you're saying you had one of these kiss up, kick down managers, and you put someone different in place, and it has good results. How can you extrapolate from that? I think you start by having some conversations. I think you start by some positive attention there, so there's an attraction. And I think you start putting guidelines in place that essentially establish a no asshole rule. I can say that because I'm quoting a professor. But that having that sort of heuristic around what behavior is acceptable here helps. You know. And sometimes, sadly, what happens in a situation like that is that the person who is being more effective without abusing people, the other people say, "You're making us look bad," and they gang up on them. So it really does take some other attention to that to begin to perpetuate those things through the organization. And it is useful for people to have that example, because many people have a legacy of people won't work hard unless we push them, so we're going to push, right? So seeing that it is actually possible can be super helpful. Did that help answer your question? Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate your attention. It's really been fun to be in Warsaw. Now I want to come back. So
Thank you, Esther.
I hope to see you again someday.